Take your seat. So I'm actually going to hand over straight away to Natalia Barazal, who is the co-head of Lombard Odier Investment Managers.
Yes, does it work? Can you all hear me? Yes? Perfectly. Well, welcome to everyone. Thanks for making the journey and spend this day in this beautiful setting. I'm frankly quite jealous of the people and the students that can spend a few years here. Amazing, you have nothing to complain about. It's really a fantastic and beautiful setting. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce you to a very informative day and fingers crossed fascinating day, no pressure for the speakers, on how key sectors need and can decarbonize. Well, the evidence of human-induced climate change is unequivocal. We know that business as normal means sleepwalking toward an environmental catastrophe. This will undermine not only the resilience of our natural world, but also the foundation of our economic prosperity. And today, no action is not an option. And with this in view, and we've noticed maybe after COP26, an acceleration of what I can call global reckoning on the corporate side about the need to have a business model that is believable, achievable to achieve target net zero or a net zero economy. Our conviction at Lombard Odier is that we are now at the beginning of a very fast transition from a wild, wasteful, idle, lopsided and dirty economy towards a clean, lean, inclusive and clean economy, from wild to click. This transition will touch almost every industry, every corporate, and being at the scale of the industrial revolution, but probably with the fast pace of a digital one. Understanding how this transition will unfold and contributing to the acceleration of this transition has been really at the core center of our investment process. We recognize the need to manage the financial risk, but also face the opportunities that such a transition and such a scale of transformation will bring together. We often know in the investment world that risk and opportunities work hand in hand. And to quote Marconi, this transition towards sustainable energy is probably the greatest commercial opportunity of our age. Our work at Lombard Odier has been both systematic and also thematic. We needed to understand the risk and opportunity of this new transition, so very scientifically, we decided to build new tools to assess those risks and those opportunities. And we created them to benchmark our investment universe versus this net zero economy. Among our flagship are the implied temperature rise and climate value impact metrics that you will hear about later on. This has enabled us to develop very innovative, forward-looking strategies, as well as integrate all those metrics into the whole setup of our funds. We are also conducting a very granular thematic analysis on food systems, energy systems, and also the circularity in materials. Here we look company by company at where innovations are being created, are emerging, that would help us get to this new economic model. And we focus on building very high conviction portfolios that give our investors the opportunity to participate and get exposure to those new shifts taking place. Our deep knowledge of sustainable finance, and I can say that without blushing too much, has been bolstered by the groundbreaking partnership we had with Oxford University. I think we signed that in 2020. Another quote that I love to say, you know, in God we trust, all others must bring data. And this has been really the basic of how we looked at sustainability, analyzing sustainability, understanding it, and building that knowledge. And that's why this partnership with Oxford University has created really a very solid academic context and infrastructure for us, for all of us. And I might use this opportunity also to salute you, your work, and all of your colleagues, because it has been really extraordinary what you brought forward. You created a clear roadmap, not just by industries or policymakers, but also for companies to follow and understand how we can and we need to decarbonize. So well done. And I think we are just as excited after 3 years on the first day to what's coming ahead of us in this partnership working together. So I applaud your work again. It's a perfect opportunity to do that. Now, I hope you enjoyed your day. I hope my hair survives the heat. It's my main challenge. And you will find this very interesting. We will have time to catch up and ask any questions you want. So let's enjoy this.
Great. Well, thank you so much for those kind remarks, and the thanks to the Oxford team for all the good work that they do. You'll notice that the built environment is not on the agenda today, but if it was, this would be a very interesting case study. You're in the newest building in the Collegiate University, opened, I think, about 3 months ago by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, and without air conditioning. So it's passively cooled. And I guess we'll have a nice opportunity to do a compare and contrast with another building later, because we're going into a Victorian building, the Natural History Museum, for dinner. So in the back of your minds, do an assessment. Has the passive cooling here worked? I think it's been built to a net zero standard, but potentially not to a climate resilient standard. Something to reflect on. Anyway, welcome to a very hot Oxford. Thank you for making the trip. My name is Ben Caldecott. I direct something called the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. We're part of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. The group was established to align finance with global environmental sustainability. We're multidisciplinary. We work across different asset classes with different finance professions and with a whole range of different bits of the financial system. We're the largest such centre globally. We'll be hitting over 40 research staff by the end of this year. And in 2020, as Natalia mentioned, we began an important multi-year partnership with LO. This has a number of key elements: research, teaching, and convening. Now, I have to say that the convening bit of the partnership took a bit of a hit with COVID, and also potentially with the heat wave, but we've managed to crack on. And this Net Zero Transition Forum is something we've developed with LO, and it's something we're hoping becomes a feature of the partnership and something that we repeat over the years. To achieve net zero, we need every sector and subsector of the global economy to transition at an incredible speed. Sectors each have different potential net zero transition pathways, each with potentially quite profound implications for the companies involved and obviously for the financial sector too. In terms of the implications for the finance sector, there are three broad buckets. The first is that these sectoral transformations create huge investment opportunities. Remember, one of the things that every single transition pathway has in common is the need for CapEx, and a lot of it. It's a CapEx-intensive transition, and that's going to create opportunities for the owners and the organisers of capital around the world. Secondly, the transition could create significant potential stranded assets that companies, financial institutions, and societies will need to navigate. And thirdly, finally, financial institutions can shape the transition positively. The capital they provide, how they provide it, and to whom, as well as how investors influence companies, policymakers, and regulators, will guide transitions. These choices might make certain sectoral pathways achievable, or more likely, and others significantly less so. So for these reasons, it makes a lot of sense to do what we're doing today, which is to focus on specific sectors, to really understand the transition pathways available to them and what that means for the companies that constitute each sector. Exploring the implications of these pathways for financial practices, whether that's portfolio management, risk pricing, strategic asset allocation, stewardship and engagement, and many others, and critically examining the role of finance in helping to realize net zero across different sectors of the global economy, all at the same time. We're hoping that each of these forums focuses on up to 3 sectors. Today's forum, we're going to be focusing on power, shipping, and agriculture. We have world-leading experts from across our university working on these topics, and you'll hear from many of them today. They're going to be joined by speakers from companies, big and small, from different financial institutions, including colleagues at LO, and other industry groups. So it should be a really fascinating day. I haven't seen very much convening focused in the way that we have described it and are planning to do it today. I also want to express my thanks to colleagues at Oxford Net Zero, the Environmental Change Institute, and the Zero Institute for partnering with us on today. And obviously I'm delighted to partner with LO on this and on many other things as well. So just a couple of final things before I hand over to the chair of the first session, Sam Fankhauser. So we organise our events so that we can peel back all the different layers, go beyond the superficiality, and that's one reason why the sessions are a bit longer than you might see at a normal industry practitioner conference. It's not a 45-minute panel session where people have a few minutes to pitch to you. We want it to be a longer discussion, and that means we spend a lot of time trying to enable audience participation. It's a smallish group. There'll be, I think there should be roving mics, and chairs and indeed speakers will welcome your contribution. So please do actively contribute. It's not just about the people up front, it's also about the audience participation. So the event's going to be recorded, and it's on the record. You will have seen there's some people wandering around with cameras. I've been told that you shouldn't smile at the camera. You're supposed to look natural, and don't make funny faces either. There might be some vox pops, I think, maybe. I don't know, but if somebody asks you whether they can ask you some questions, please be accommodating if you can be. Some logistical things. So the loos are down the stairs. As you come in, there's a staircase, go down a level or two. Obviously, it's very hot. We have lots of water available. If you're feeling uncomfortable, please let somebody know. We can bring water to you. And you've got the Wi-Fi code up here. Perfect day, apparently is the password. Bloody hot day, more like. Anyway, so thank you so much for coming, particularly on such a day, and I hope you enjoy today. So Sam, over to you and your panel.
Thank you, Ben, and hello, everybody. We have a panel of 5, which means I'm going to stand here, because in the spirit of musical chairs, there's 5 chairs, 5 panelists, who are trying to find out how they're sitting themselves down. There's no order, you sit wherever you're comfortable. So my name is Sam Fankhauser. I'm based in the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. I'm Professor of Climate Economics and Policy there. I'm also Research Director of Oxford Net Zero, which is one of the sponsors of today's event. And I'm going to chair this opening session, which is about net zero, the basics or the context. And we are going to start our conversation of net zero with a panel of 5 who look at net zero from very different angles. They each come from their own particular sector or background who can add to our understanding of net zero. Let me introduce them, and the running order after that is that each one of them gets something like 5 minutes or so of an opening pitch. We then have a few sort of questions that come from me to warm up the panel and warm up the audience. Not sure warming up is the right thing to use. You know what I mean. And then we're opening up for questions and answers. So that's the plan. Let me introduce the panel then in the order in which they will speak. So we will start with Miles Allen on your right there. Miles is Professor of Geosystem Science here at Oxford. He's also one of my colleagues at Oxford Net Zero, is the director of Oxford Net Zero. Miles is one of the leading sort of climate scientists in this space, and the reason why we talk about net zero is in no small part because of Miles's work. He was the one who explained the world that if we want to stabilize climate change, we need net zero. So he has a lot to answer for in that respect. So let's see how he can defend himself. We then have Claire Perry-O'Neill next. Claire is, many of you will know her, most of you will know her. She's a recovering politician, very successful one. Politician, that is, not the recovery, actually probably both. She was a very successful politician, member of parliament for 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth. And when I say successful, let me just give you two examples. If you think what the UK has achieved on climate change, two things people usually talk about is the net zero target in COP26. Claire has sort of been responsible for lining up both of those things. She guided the net zero legislation through Parliament, and she got COP26 to the UK, and she was president-elect. Let's not debate what happened when she left, but she left Parliament in 2020, and so the chairmanship of COP26 went somewhere else. But that's clear. Great to have you here. We then have two finance people and an investor to round up the panel. Next to speak will be Oliver Greyer, all the way to my right, to your left. Oliver is Program Director of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. He is Program Director there, as I said, has been there for about 6 years. The IIGCC is a mouthful as an acronym, but it's also a very influential group. It brings together 350 or so institutional investors who between them have over 50 trillion euros in assets under management, so he's a man with influence as well. We then have Erika Vranegaard, who sits in the middle there of the panel. She is on the fixed income side in the financial sector as a fixed income manager of Lombard Odier, our sponsors today. She has a focus on sustainability, has been doing sustainability for a long time. Before Lombard Odier, she worked in Sweden, in an asset manager called Earlman, where she ran 2 sustainability funds. So we will hear from her next. And then last but not least, we have Marianne Tikkanen, second on the left there. Marianne is an entrepreneur and an expert in innovation, an expert of moving clever ideas from idea to commercialization. Her latest sort of adventure in doing that is a company called Puro Earth, which is a marketplace for carbon removal, so something we need more of. So we will hear from Marianne how it feels to be at the coalface, yet another term one shouldn't use, of the green transition. So that's our panel. As I said, they will each get 5 minutes to set up their stall before we open it for discussion. And we start with Miles Allen. Miles has slides. I have no idea how the technology will work, but they will somehow appear. There they are. Miles, over to you.
Yes, okay, so I hope I won't need 5 minutes, because it's pretty simple what I'm wanting you to remember. This is where we're at. This is a nice figure from a paper led by Sam, published in Nature Climate Change this year. And it shows where we're at the moment, with massive fluxes of carbon out of the lithosphere, the solid Earth, into the atmosphere, out of the biosphere, into the atmosphere. There's some return from the atmosphere to the biosphere, but not enough. Both lithosphere and biosphere are fluxing carbon into the atmosphere. You can see from those arrows, the atmosphere, the stock of carbon in the atmosphere is going up, and that's driving global warming.
So what most, we know that, we've understood that, and one of the refreshing things that has happened over the past decade has been how universally everybody's come to accept that's what's going on and that's what's got to stop. And that gets us to the next destination, if we go to the next slide, which shows what at a guess, most people in this room think of as net zero, which is where we're balancing the fluxes of carbon in and out of the atmosphere so that it's no longer going up. Or to be, if I want to get sort of a bit more technical with you, we're balancing the fluxes of human-induced carbon in and out of the atmosphere, because there's going to be natural fluxes as well, but it's the human contributions that matter here. There's enormous natural fluxes of carbon through the system, but it's our disturbances of them that are driving the global warming. So you can see here, it's been carefully drawn so that the arrows add up. So you'll notice that now you've got the arrows going into the atmosphere match in thickness the arrows going out of it. So all very well and good. We've stopped the world warming. But hopefully you just look at this figure behind me and realise that can't last forever, because we've still got a net flux of carbon out of the lithosphere, out of fossil carbon underground, into the biosphere, planting trees, restoring the biosphere. You'll notice, by the way, that the biosphere is growing again. It's going back to where it was before. But that's not which is a good thing. We need to put carbon back into the biosphere. We've depleted the stocks of carbon in the biosphere, but we can't count on the biosphere mopping up fossil carbon emissions forever. And so if we're going to get to a durable net zero, which is the next stage of our journey, if we go to the next slide, this is where we eventually need to get to, where there is a balance between all the fluxes of carbon in all three spheres. So we're putting any carbon, you'll notice the big black line coming out of the lithosphere has shrunk a lot, so we're taking out a lot less fossil carbon. I don't know how fat that line will be. Perhaps it'll be all the way down towards zero, but probably not at zero. So we're going to have to putting carbon back into the lithosphere, back underground, permanently disposing of it at the same rate that we're pulling it out. This is durable net zero, where we're balancing all the carbon flows in the climate system. And what I worry about whether the financial system and many corporations have really taken on board is this is what we need to get to. Just, turning rocks, basically, if you remember nothing else, remember this: turning rocks into trees is not a sustainable activity. So we can't rely on the biosphere to mop up our fossil fuel emissions forever. We need to be moving to a stage where we're producing so little fossil CO2 that we can fully compensate for it by putting CO2 back underground. And that means, of course, building up. As well as reducing the amount of fossil fuel CO2 we produce, we need to build up our capacity for getting rid of it permanently. And we need to start thinking of the challenge of achieving net zero as this balance of the Earth's surface. We need geological net zero. Every ton of CO2 released by continued use of fossil fuels needs to be compensated for by a ton of CO2 permanently disposed of back underground. That's at the moment, by the way, the fraction globally is 0.1%. So we've set ourselves a target of raising that to 100% by 2050. It's only a factor of 1,000. But before I sign off, let me just remind you the cost of doing that, even recapturing it from the atmosphere, would be less than the additional amount of money we're pumping into the fossil fuel sector between last year and this, with high fossil fuel prices. But this is a solvable problem. But of course, that money's going probably to some of your companies and some of your pensions and so on. So how are we going to redirect that money to solve the problem? Discuss.
Okay, good, and that's what we shall do. Thank you very much, Miles. Let's move on to Claire, and let's hear how this scientific challenge, as it were, is being translated into policy or policy thinking.
Thank you. I don't have slides, but the joy of being a recovering politician is I basically now get to spend my life talking about facts. Facts like CO2 removal is necessary for net zero, Brexit probably bad for the UK economy, and cutting taxes when the state is creaking, not the smartest economic policy. And that is all I'm going to say about the leadership election. But I think, having been in the space, thank you very much for your nice shout out. Yeah, I mean, we had a sort of golden time actually in the UK government in the sort of 2016-17 where, with the advice of the Committee on Climate Change, with a commitment from the then Prime Minister to really exploring the positive parts of this transition, we were able to bring in the amendment to the Climate Change Act to put net zero legislation in law and essentially set loose a number of ecosystems around green finance, carbon capture and storage, and the hydrogen economy, which are really starting to bear fruit. And I'll mention that briefly. And then, of course, we pitched for COP26 and won, and I got the pleasure of writing the action plan for COP26 before I departed politics. And the point about COP, and we won't go into the UN ecosystem, is, we treat COP as if it is somehow this an all singing, all dancing enabled mechanism to deliver meaningful change. It's not. It's a convention. It is an assembly that a country pitches to host every year. But nothing that is written down at COP, from the Paris Agreement to the Glasgow Declaration, has any meaning in law. And those agreements are generally signed by politicians who, I think, can't wait to get back to their day jobs. And I don't know about you, but sometimes politicians don't necessarily keep their promises. Happens occasionally, I know. Particularly when we face a huge energy crisis and this rush to energy sovereignty. And as much as we can sit here and say, rightly, if we had moved to a substantially renewable economy in terms of our energy system, we would be far less exposed to these global energy shocks. The truth of the matter is, 85% of our energy need is still being provided by fossil fuels, and we are where we are. And I think, having said that, and we'll see what happens at COP27, the Bonn intercessionals, which is where the civil servants get together and talk about the agenda, ended quite badly. They couldn't even agree an agenda for the 2 weeks, let alone any breakthroughs. There's quite a typical cycle of a good cop, bad cop, so I don't think too many people are surprised. Interestingly, going forward to COP28, which is in the Middle East, my sense is a lot of this really interesting work about fossil fuels and carbon take back could really start to come to the boil, again using the wrong phraseology. So I haven't given up at all on the COP ecosystem, because it's our moment, if you like, to actually gather and focus and discuss. And when I was at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we noted the extreme ambition of many corporates, including LO and others, to be part of this conversation. And remember, there is no statutory place for them to be. In fact, do you know how many times the word business appeared in the Glasgow Declaration, the 8-page declaration? 0 times. And this is very bizarre to me as a concept. But the businesses are very, very keen for their contributions to be counted, and we have developed a global accountability and transparency mechanism that we would like to sit alongside the NDCs, and there's some real traction about that. But, are we in a bad place? I mean, of course, energy shocks have a moment of focusing people's minds. And you see both some of the politicians rowing back from their commitments, and then also a legal challenge to the government's net zero legislation, which I find personally quite disappointing, if I'm truthful, because, having that target in law, having the continual process, I know from my work just how very, very tough this is for the government, but there is a relentless focus on the delivery of it through all these policy mechanisms. And I don't think it sends the right message to the global political community that if you go so far as to put a net zero package in place and legislate for it, then suddenly you're going to be attacked by all your lawyers. This is not the signal I think we need to send. But the benefit, if you like, of this unprecedented outbreak of reality is definite. So we are being forced to focus on the details, and whether it's developing a Scope 3 emissions measurement hopper and data inquiry protocol, as the WBCSD is doing with some consulting firms, whether it's really focusing hard on blended finance, and what exactly is the role of blended finance, a phrase we all chuck around, but can you point to any transactions in the sustainability space that have been a wild global success? I can't. The closest we got was the South African country platform that I started off, which is a great step forward, focusing that public and private capital on a very specific energy transition. But we're 8 months in, and that is still struggling for governance and structure. It doesn't mean it won't succeed, it just means it's tough. And I think what we have got to do is have this massive outbreak of pragmatism. And Miles is, focus on net zero, focus on the fossil fuels, focus on the need for carbon removal and geologic, permanent storage has to be part of this mix. And we know it'll be controversial. Justin and I have had these battles about NCS for the last 3 years, which in some ways is less controversial because of all the co-benefits. But we've just got to stop treating this as, forgive me, as an academic exercise and start treating this as a massive problem that we've all got to globally solve and slightly put in our backpacks our ideological positions and really focus on the solutions. And then the other thing I'd mention is I think one of the really interesting things, and this relates to finance or the policy space, is we have to stop kind of othering net zero and sustainability. Somehow it's treated as a sort of special there be dragons conversation and people go in prepared to battle rather than to problem solve. And I think if this energy crisis and high fossil fuels and the fact that coal is now at the highest level of emissions ever, and also the extreme weather is telling us something, this means we have to treat this as a real problem with real solutions rather than some sort of special case. Do I think the politicians are going to lead us out of this? Some places. I mean, there are some very encouraging countries all around the world who are absolutely making this transition part of their fundamental economic strategy and their long-term plan. And actually China has been very clear in their 14th five-year plan exactly what the role of renewables and electric vehicles will be. But I also think it's a time to just not say this is your problem, this is all of our problems. And what we've got to do is have forums where we can all come together, where we have to accept that this is tough. And that we have to focus very, very specifically on solutions. And that's why coming today and actually having solutions that are very sector specific with also the lens of finance, I think is hugely important. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. So we have the policy challenge, the scientific challenge. Let's turn to finance, and let's start with Oliver, who can sort of outline how the sector, the business, the profession has responded so far. Oliver.
Thank you very much. I'll give the investor perspective on approaching net zero and sectors and really where investors are thinking next in terms of their perhaps starting at the top, investors and what, of course, does that mean? From our perspective, it means a number of different things and build a framework to think about investment portfolio that looks at a range of different dimensions. Too loud. Looking from a top-down perspective, at the aggregate emissions trajectory of a portfolio and the aggregate level of green solutions in the portfolio, recognising that both of those dimensions are important. But I think crucially we're also looking at the proportion of companies in a portfolio that have a high quality transition plan. And that's in full recognition that companies across different sectors have different trajectories. They don't all add up to 7%. And that the solution and the pathway forward for each company is going to be subtly different depending on the geographic layout of its business, whether its emissions are in emerging markets or developed markets, and the type of industry it's in, whether it's got legacy fossil assets that have a place in the net zero transition for an period or whether it doesn't. But really, at the heart of our thinking about portfolio alignment is what each and every individual company does, and looking at how we can tell the story at portfolio level about how each of them has a high quality plan. And really how are investors thinking about helping to support and accelerate the transition? It's by working with each one of those companies through corporate engagement, through provision of debt financing, and a range of other mechanisms. I guess my key reflection is going to be on the key vehicle that investors have used for engagement with companies, an initiative that we run called Climate Action 100 Plus, a coalition of 700 investors with 70 trillion in assets that started in 2017 with 3 high-level asks of the largest 150 emitters in the world to to improve their governance of climate risk, to set an action plan to deliver portfolio net zero alignment, and then to align their reporting with all of that. You know, in the 3 to 4 years that initiative's run now, we have 110 firms of 166 committed to net zero and developing their transition plan. We now have a tool to assess their transition plans, however rudimentary those kind of tools currently are. And we see a lot of work across the different companies to provide more disclosure to investors to help them understand whether they're moving in the right way or whether they're not. We're piloting enhanced frameworks with different sectors, working with the largest oil and gas companies, mining companies, banks to develop enhanced frameworks to understand their transition, but also trying to be reflective in and understanding the different pathways that are emerging as energy crises hit and transform potentially the way and the shape of the transition strategy of each company. So where next? What are investors thinking as we think about our engagement with companies? I think there are kind of three things that I kind of want to highlight in the context of changes in the energy environment, the rising prominence of energy security, and so on. The first is, I think investors are shifting focus from decarbonisation wholesale, i.e. the 7% a year or whatever the decarbonisation trajectory is, and looking to focus on the upscale of financing. So we have done a study with FTSE Russell, the London Stock Exchange, to try to understand what proportion of revenues in the FTSE All Share should be green. And what we're finding is that green revenues in the index need to rise from around 5% of all revenues in the index to around 30% of all revenues in the index by 2030, which is like the tech boom of the 1990s happening in the next kind of 6 to 7 years. So the focus on solutions, the focus on being positive and innovative, I think is going to be critical if we're going to make that kind of transition in the index happen. I think focusing unilaterally on decarbonisation pathways is probably not going to be enough to create the solutions and innovation in thinking that's needed. I think the second dimension that we're increasingly thinking about is not thinking just about the word alignment and what it means to align with net zero at a company level or portfolio level, but looking at the degree of benchmark divergence. And by what we mean by that is the degree to which a company is over or under contributing to the net zero outcome. So to deliver 30% uptick in green revenues, I don't think it's going to be evenly distributed across companies. There are going to be winners and losers. Investors will be looking and are looking to find which companies are going to be at the vanguard of this transition. Because if they're holding an index passive fund, they want to be overweight on those companies early if they're going to make up 30% of the index over time. The final thing, I guess, is a more pragmatic one. We do engagement with lots of different companies, lots of different sectors, lots of different regions, and are having discussions about accelerating net zero plans all the time. And the pragmatic reality is getting to net zero in some sectors is financially challenging without the policy support. Companies are setting objectives to reduce emissions by a quarter by 2030 when it needs to be a half. I think there is perhaps a nervousness between investors and corporates. Corporates feel like they're under pressure from investors to accelerate their targets and are perhaps holding back a little bit. I think the key that investors are looking at this point and looking to work with companies on is how to bridge that gap between a 25% cut in emissions by 2030 and a 50% cut by 2030. And I think what that takes is corporates explaining in some detail what kind of policy support they need to bridge the gap from a mediocre target to a very good target, and coming to investors to collaborate on policy dialogue, on dialogue up and down the value chain, recognizing that investors have holdings up and down the value chain, and also talking about how we can do better financing on the debt side, whether that's blended finance or otherwise. There is a lot of capital now, given all these net zero commitments, that is looking to be deployed. And really the best way to do that is to hear from companies and to think innovatively about how we can do that. So I guess my concluding remark would be that, that's the big picture from finance and I think the direction of travel. We're very keen to hear from companies across sectors about what investors can be doing to support them in their very nuanced sector transitions. I look forward to speaking to you over the afternoon.
Super, thanks, Oliver. And I like the sound of the next tech boom, because I'm sure we want to talk about the opportunities when we come to the Q&A. But it's always good to have a second opinion. So we have two people from that sector on the panel. Erika, how do you, at Lombard Odier, how do you deal with the transition?
I think that gives me some great foundation to build on as I put maybe a more practical approach to how we're integrating net zero at Lombard Odier.
Sorry, can I just check, can people hear Erika? Or is there a way of getting the mic up a little bit?
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So at Lombard Odier, we believe that sustainability will be the major driver of the return for the foreseeable future and beyond. And we believe that the net zero transition will have major economic impact and will create short-term risks and opportunities. Our approach, it allows us to align our portfolios with companies best positioned to capitalize on these investment opportunities. But it also allows us to identify the systemic risk of those companies which have not understood the urgency and the need for the transition. And contrary to much of the market, which is still focused on overweighting the low carbon companies like tech and underweighting the high emission sectors, such as steel and shipping, we actually see some of the most interesting investment opportunities in the high emission sectors. Because that's where we believe that the decarbonization will be needed much strongly going forward. And it's also in this high carbon sectors and in high carbon companies where we see the greatest potential for pricing differentials as regulation is extended and consumer preferences change. There will be a significant potential for a price differentiation between a clean and a dirty steel manufacturer going forward. And we want to capture that alpha opportunity. We call the high emission issuers with a credible decarbonization strategy ice cubes, as they are in fact helping cooling the planet. At the same time, we want to avoid being invested in the most carbon intensive industries and issuers where we don't see that they have a credible decarbonization strategy. These are the companies that we named our burning logs, as they are in fact still warming the planet. So the question then becomes, how do we apply this conceptual framework into our investment portfolios? At Lombard Odier, our dedicated sustainability team of research analysts have created a methodology that is science-based and forward-looking, the Lombard Odier implied temperature rise. The methodology starts by assessing the carbon footprint of a company. And what we believe is unique here is that it considers scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which gives us a holistic view of the company's carbon exposure. From that, we can assess how the material the shift to a low carbon economy will be for that company. Carbon footprints is the starting point for our analysis. Secondly, our sustainability team then takes the carbon budget, split it across 150 different industries across 6 different geographical regions to find the needed decarbonization for each sector within each region, given the degree of global warming. And thirdly, we derive the path of the company's emissions using historical trends of emissions, targets, and commitments that the company have made. And how much weight we put to the company's achieving the targets, that depends on how credible we judge the company's target to be. We look at indicators of strategy and governance within our methodology, such as, do the company have a board member accountable for climate action? Are climate targets science-based? And is remuneration tied within the company to climate outcomes? These are a few of the indicators that we look at when assessing and making the judgment. So the ITR then tells us the resulting global warming if every company acted with the same level of ambitions as the firms within our portfolio. And we can do this analysis for 20,000 companies within our investment universe. And for us as a portfolio manager, for me on a day-to-day basis, it gives a powerful forward-looking assessment that would enable us to go beyond the carbon footprint analysis and do a thorough analysis informing us of whether a company is aligned or misaligned to a net zero future. And from this net zero future, we can build portfolios with higher low tracking error across different sectors in line with the net zero future. Portfolios which have the return to deliver decarbonization as well as financial returns.
Thank you. Very interesting, and good to see that you're sort of going, into the institutional makeup of a company, not just into the emissions. I'm sure we will come back to that. But before that, let's hear from Marianne, who isn't part of the 5% or 30% green revenues. She is 100% pure play green. Marianne.
But there is below green, there is deep green or net negative. So you can actually go below zero, and that's what is our mission. So please, can I have my slides up? And so shortly about Pura.Earth. Our mission is to mobilize world economy to reward these kind of deep green, net negative carbon removals. We have been doing that for the past 3 years in commercial operation. It's a co-created standard registry and marketplace for negative carbon removals or net negative actions. We, of course, need the supply side. There are hundreds of early stage projects in our system in different technologies like biochar, BECCS and DACCS, so putting carbon back to the geology, carbonated materials, mineralization, bio-based materials, or burying biomass. And on the demand side, there are pioneering corporates who have seen the light that avoiding some or paying for credits that avoid emissions somewhere else than in their own operations is not going to get to net zero. They do need to remove physical carbon from the atmosphere and put it to a long-standing storage. And please take the next slide. So we have our role is to matchmake not only the buyers and the sellers, so the supply and demand side, but also the investors who make this happen. And here are some feedback from the both sides. They don't yet very much meet in the middle, and that is what we are trying to make happen, mediate and be in the middle to make two sides understand each other. And here I have to confess that I'm an engineer from renewable energy side, so very much trying to understand the investors' need and then convey that message back to the carbon removal projects. They have received offers which they don't find attractive, and on the other side, the investors think that these projects have too uncertain markets, too early technology, too long payment times, too small project sizes. There is very much that needs to happen for this to really be mainstream and grow. Next, please. That is in a sense, a very normal technology curve. The costs have to come down. The proof of concepts have received venture capital, but now they need to move from VC funding to project funding, commercial debt, words that I don't understand coming from the engineering side. but you'll explain me, and by the end of these 3 days, I'll be an expert. What do you need for this to happen? I can take that message back, but also there needs to be a compromise. I was very happy for Ben to use the word capex. This is an industry. Carbon removal is physical carbon moving. It is capital intense. It works like any capital intense market. Look at solar, look at wind, look at the instruments that were useful there. Feed-in tariffs, of course, helped a lot. Off-take agreement, long pre-purchase agreements, this kind of instruments, credit, insurance. You've seen it before, you've done it before. Let's just do it a little bit faster than last time.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Marianne. Let me ask one question while you gather your thoughts, and let me pick on Claire, just because I can. We've been here before. We had the clean development mechanism, which is a beautiful industry. We've had the greenest government ever that then wanted to get rid of the green crap. We've had stops and goes. Why is it different this time? Why will it happen this time?
Do you mean in the UK?
Globally, actually.
Because I think we're starting to talk about the how rather than the why for greenhouse gases. Actually, when it comes to nature and biodiversity loss and inequality, we're still talking about the why, which I think is a real challenge. But I think in the sort of GHG space, we're actually coming up the curve of understanding the why and really focusing on the how. And I love what Marianne said about this is about capex. This is carbon. You're not going to make money on unicorns, tech unicorns. Or you might make one or two, but most of this is a heavy engineering and financial engineering challenge. And despite my sort of slightly facetious comments about the government, if you look at the meticulous work that's been done on how you create a market-based system for carbon capture and storage, and we can debate, the ideology of that, but ultimately the UK is being seen as the place where cluster-based CCS is starting to happen, because we're starting to target this panoply of subsidy and private sector investment and financing models to actually deliver some results. So and the same with carbon removal, and Miles can talk about this, in terms of developing a policy and then a space, and the same also with carbon trading. And I sit on the board of the CIX Exchange, who I know doing some work with you in Singapore. I think there is a sense that, again, we understand there is a lot of ideology around this, but we understand there is a huge need for this. As Miles said, we are not going to transfer, I loved your point about the rock to the nature, but we know that this will be there. And so it's starting to happen. So it feels like we're now wrestling with the how. And behind the scenes and behind the sort of, slightly some of the backsliding comments, whether it's CCS, whether it's the hydrogen economy that really feels starting to be very tangible now, whether it's some of the real focus on geological storage, and all of the above, right, because there's no silver bullet. I think we're starting to get into the how rather than just the why.
Very good. Let's open it up. There's a question there. Let's collect maybe 2 or 3. There's one there, then there's a lady at the back and the gentleman in the white shirt. Then we go back to the panel. There is one. It's far away. Right? Yeah. The mic is coming. Sorry, all eyes are on you. No pressure. Maybe shout. Try shouting.
I'll project. So, is that on now?
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Worth waiting for.
4th time lucky, Mike with a mic. My name is Mike Clark, and I'd like to pick up some of the sort of little themes I've picked up with a hypothesis around how, which leads to a question. So Miles's 0.1% demonstrates the difference between science and finance. The plea for capex demonstrates part of the problem. So the hypothesis is that political economy has too much economics and not enough politics for people, that economics has too much financial economics, the risk-free rate is only risk-free to financial economists and central bankers, that finance needs to embrace a much wider form of economics. And I just know one project, the East project, that some of you will know, which is a Bayes-funded 3 million project, but 3 million will not save the world. So the question is, how can the economists who can cope with uncertainty and can cope with risk displace the mainstream economics thinking during my working life that has become increasingly narrow and financial? Because with the greatest respect to our hosts, alpha won't solve the problem, beta is a great problem, because beta doesn't do strategic risk management society, it does strategic risk management for asset allocation. So my question is tackling the economics thinking that we probably believe without realizing it. Thank you.
Okay, think about that one while we collect two more. The gentleman in the white shirt is probably easier to reach, and then the lady just behind him.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Alex Tate. I'm with BP, working on the Net Zero Teesside carbon capture and storage project. So Claire, thank you for everything you did with the clusters there. That was great. It's been really interesting to hear a range of different perspectives from the technical, from the policy enablers, the influencers, finance, and particularly your interest in investing in greening institutions. You said high emission sectors that are looking to decarbonise. I think it's safe to say I represent one of those. Amidst a cost of living crisis, a lot of geopolitical headwinds, I think one of our biggest risks going forwards, and perhaps a voice that's very hard to represent, is public opinion and often opposition, particularly to debatable projects like carbon capture and storage. And I'm really interested to hear what you think we all need to do, our responsibility in attempting to influence that, because I think that has in my opinion, one of the highest likelihoods of shutting down certain industries that we need to decarbonise across the economy. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Your question, and just pass it on a row back.
Thank you. Sarah Barker from Minter Ellison Lawyers. I'm a corporate governance lawyer. This is a question, I think, for Erica and perhaps Oliver. I was interested in your comments about nominating a single board member as having responsibility for the climate project or the climate progress within a company. Often boards aren't structured that way, where you have a single person who's responsible. They've got committee structures. So I'm just curious as to, are we talking about holding the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, chair of the Sustainability Committee, et cetera, responsible? How are investors looking at that in practice?
Okay, so we have 3 questions. Let me see who wants to do what. Maybe Erica and Oliver, you were name-checked on that last one. Erica, you had institutional indicators, so board members responsible for climate?
Happy to share some views on that. What we want to see as a framework is a responsibility throughout the organizations for meeting other targets than financial objectives. We want that to be represented at the board level. We want to see that within management, as well as within the other functions within the organizations. So I think clearly defining what responsibilities are and where they lie can have a huge benefit, especially in the following up on meeting the commitments and meeting the outcomes that we need to achieve.
Oliver, you want to?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. I think, as I outlined the kind of 3 core asks of the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative: governance, action plan, disclosure. I think I hesitate to quote the exact number, but something north of 130 companies on that focus list has a board member that's responsible for climate. Now, I think that the issue with board oversight is a question of the specifics, and the specifics of whether they're responsible for climate in a very general sense, or whether they're responsible for the net zero transition plan or transition strategy, as they're two different things. A couple of companies that we have dialogued with have also said, well, our net zero strategy is our strategy, which kind of leads to the point, it's kind of the CEO's job to make sure that net zero is baked in there. I think the horizon that we're looking at when it comes to governance is remuneration, or certainly a lot of investors are thinking about remuneration. I remain a little bit sceptical, given the challenges of getting good remuneration full stop, that climate can be baked into remuneration strategies to incentivize businesses. But, you know, there's many different dimensions to that. But certainly board governance is a key factor, and I'm fairly sure that we will see many more investors looking at the director vote in particular when it comes to activating their stewardship of their portfolios.
Very good. And the other question was how to get CCS done. I know Miles has firm views on that, so why don't we start there?
Well, I think picking up on actually what Oliver was saying earlier on about the need for companies to make clear to their investors what the regulations are that companies need to continue to invest safely in whatever sector they're in, to continue to invest the investors' money safely in whatever sector they're engaged with, I think is at the heart of this. One of my frustrations in this space is talking to so many people in the fossil fuel industry who tell me, sure, given the right regulations, we'd just fix the problem. But they don't say that in public. And the public don't get that. And so that's why I think the public are feeling, at the moment, to be honest, with quite a lot of justification, that the industry's getting away with murder. Because it's just carrying on selling its products, and we, the taxpayer, are paying for these big CCS projects. Not that I don't think these big CCS projects are going to, shouldn't happen. Of course they should happen. But I think we need the industry to be stepping up and saying how it's going to build getting rid of CO2 into the business model of selling products that generate CO2 going forward. It's got to be part and parcel of the same thing. And I think the public will get that. Because, you know, we understand that the water companies get rid of our waste. We don't mind paying for sewage disposal. Maybe 170 years ago they would have objected and they said, no, it's somebody else's problem. But now we get it. And the same sort of mind shift needs to happen for CO2. And I was fascinated by the question about new economics, but it's not my area, so I'm not going to delve into that. But I just wonder whether there's space here if we sort of start reframing the problem as one of waste disposal. We might be able to bring a broader range of economic instruments to bear on it than we have at the moment.
Okay, Marianne, you want to have a go at that as well?
Complementary on that, in energy markets or any functioning markets, there is a merit order, so the cheapest gets financed and purchased first, so that might help to create a functioning market across all different types of carbon removal, not only fossil CO2 back underground, but all variants of it, biogenic CO2 and so on. I would like to add, Oliver, you said about it's CEO's business to do a net zero plan, and other industries, not only fossil. We have projects in steel industry, sugar industry, rice, wheat, so very far from fossil industry, who didn't know that they actually can do carbon removal, so more than net zero, they can go beyond zero to the negative side. They already have the biomass, they need to transform the biomass from the burning cycle to a removing cycle. And for that they need, they often start with a small proof of concept. They are big corporates, they are big old industries that need a transformation. They do a small proof of concept and then they can go big. They do need to change their procedures and often invest in the removal equipment and renewable energy equipment at the same time. And I think that that's opportunities the CEOs don't know about. They never realized, nobody in the board realized that we can do this. And that's a lot of education that is needed in the not so close to fossil energy world.
Okay, Claire, that leaves the question where we need new politics, new economics, new policy.
And I've been thinking really hard about it. And there's, again, so part of me feels that perhaps we're just trying to create a new universal framework for this challenge of sustainability. And I sort of slightly reject that because ultimately, I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a geographer, but traditional economics is return maximization. And ultimately, and you were alluding to this, Erica, you're looking at companies who you believe will generate higher returns from selling green goods, and the way they'll achieve those higher returns is a combination of policy, regulation, consumer behavior, capital costs, etc. But also, you know, we do believe that carbon is going up. The cost of carbon is no longer an unpriced externality, it's going up, and that's very clear from both the ETS markets and the global markets, but also from internal carbon prices. Companies are generally seeing that go up. So you're return maximizing, if you're reducing the cost of carbon and you're generating higher returns, should indeed go up. But I also wanted to come back to the point about BP and Teesside, and thank you very much for the nice comment, because again, I think that we perhaps need to park this idea of the general universal framework or the general framework global agreement and look at what's happening on the ground. Because I think the people of Teesside are rather supportive of carbon capture and storage because they see that they've been told, and it will be the case, that there's a huge new economic industry, and it's making stuff, to your point, Marion, this is engineering stuff that's happening. And this is very jobs generative. And so I think it's, you know, and what you essentially want is these clusters of opportunity almost joining up. And the conditions for success of those will be different in different markets because governments will choose to do different things. I mean, electric vehicle charging installation in Norway, pretty good industry given the regulation. CCS in the UK, again, something that we can do. Renewables, when we did the offshore wind sector deal, and we brought in a very clear UK content for kit, not just supply vessels, you know, we're really starting to see the opening of factories making stuff for that global industry. So I'm not convinced we do need new economic thinking. I'm convinced we just need to focus on the delivery. Thank you. Well, you might be a professor of economics and have one, which is perfect, and you should publish, sir. But I think that what will happen is, people say, yes, with the economists, you know, they got everything else wrong. The black swan events aren't priced into the models, and I'm happy to be convinced. But I just think we need to get on with it. We've got the pricing signals, we've got the demand, we've got the markets. I mean, does anyone think that the cost of carbon is going to go down over the next 20 years? No. Does anyone think that the benefit, that the premium, the green premium for truthfully verified low carbon materials is going to go up? Yes, and also, by the way, when you start to see carbon border adjustments, which are real and are going to happen, then we start to see some of the ways to get into those super hard to decarbonise supply chains globally, and particularly to get coal off the grid.
Let me just, before I go back to the audience, check with the two investors, with Erica and Oliver, the extent to which you feel you need regulatory support, regulatory push, to what extent you feel the voluntary things that you have set up will get you there. What's the balance between regulation and voluntary action for you, Oliver?
I mean, so I think it's obvious in many of the discussions that we have across different sectors that they cannot set as ambitious targets as they would like to because certain technologies or pathways for their business aren't going to generate the kind of returns that make sense. So how do you solve that? You think innovatively about how you provide finance, and you think about how you get the right regulation to support that kind of innovation. It's what happens in every other element of business, you know, with lobby groups. I think where we are, and you know, I'm not a bit sceptical about the need for new economics. I think basically every sector needs to think about precisely what they need from others, put it on the table, and come to investors to kind of collaborate and think about how we can get things done. I was thinking about shipping just now for some reason, just thinking about the issue of bunkering of fuel internationally. It's such a horribly complicated problem to solve. Who's going to have the answer? It's going to be the shipping industry. It's not likely to be the regulators in different geographies. To come up with the answers, come to the financiers, put these solutions on the table, and let's try and solve them. I just think it's going to be a very bitty process. I think the key is that companies feel comfortable. At the moment, everyone is under lots and lots of pressure to look like they are as green as green. We all know that getting to net zero is going to be much more complicated and a wavy path. I think companies need to be much more kind of open and honest about the fact that it's going to be difficult and that they're going to need support to do it. I mean, I think the kind of the Teesside example is interesting. I think it's great. There's kind of, I think the CCS, Oil and Gas Climate Initiative's got like 6 clusters or something, hasn't it? But we know we need like 50 a year or something crazy like that. So tell us what the plan is to go from 6 to 50. Tell us what investment scale up that's going to need, and tell us what private finance and public finance you need, because the investors aren't, the investors will ask the questions, but they're not going to come up with a plan to go from 6 to 50. And in that way, we can lean in and support. At the moment, it feels like, oh yeah, we're going this far, and it feels like everyone's glossing things up a bit. And I think we need to kind of accept the reality, be honest and an adult, and move on constructively. I think the public will respond positively to that. I also think that as we generate economies of scale, that the type of support, there will need to be changes in the way that the government policy supports. I was speaking to a friend who's an offshore engineer doing offshore wind, and his current worry is that with current price, wholesale gas prices where they are, offshore wind is making a healthy return without the subsidies, and so the subsidies might need to move around. So, it's about being reflexive and dynamic as well. The best way to hear about that is from companies in their planning.
Very good. We have. Okay, please, yes, sorry, Erika.
Insights from the hands-on approach and what I'm seeing in financial markets when it comes to CCS. I think the Green Guild, which came out, was very innovative and daring, including CCS. And if I should be honest, that was quite a controversial thing to do within the green bond market. So I think as investors as well, there is the consideration of greenwashing. And what we need to have is these genuine discussions of how we can transform our societies. And that will come from the leading institutions, from the leading investors, from the leading corporations within this space sharing best practice, because it's only those issuers that can credibly come out with these type of innovations that can provide the financing for these type of solutions. And then we need to demonstrate by action that that is how we finance the transition, and that's how we get the mainstream market to follow. But I would say that the first issues that will come out, there will be controversies and there will be headlines around it, but that should not discourage us from doing it.
Okay, very good. We have maybe one more question, maybe two, if you ask them quickly. All the way in the back. Then we come to the front.
So I'll try and be quick. I'm Bob Eccles. I'm at the Said Business School. I'm clearly American. Claire, let me tell you what it's like on the ground in America. So 14 of the top 20 asset managers are American. They've got over 50% of assets under management. 4 of the top 5 are American. They've got about 25%. You've got the Republican Party that's weaponizing climate change. It's not just skeptical. Texas has created a list of 159 financial institutions they won't do business with if they don't think they're supporting the fossil fuel industry. The Supreme Court says the EPA can't regulate emissions out of power companies, power plants. That was backed by the supermajority Supreme Court that's going to be sued. A suit's going to go to them around the SEC's proposal around climate change under the First Amendment by the Chamber of Commerce. That'll be with West Virginia, and Joe Manchin yesterday said he won't support any environmental funding in a state that has 0.5% of the U.S. population. So here's the question. Do you think the things that we're talking about, cross-border adjustments, carbon taxes, do you think this will put enough pressure on the United States to get over this extraordinary political swing to the right? And if not, do you think if the U.S. keeps going down the path it's going, All these things everybody's doing in this room, which are great, at a global level, we just can't get there. I mean, we are the biggest carbon emitter and we're the richest country in the world so far. And we're going exactly in the wrong direction.
Okay, very good. Let's leave it at that question if you're happy there. And slots we could say. Who has opinions on the US? Maybe Claire?
You know, it's tragic, right? And it was it was amazing when we had a change of government and we had John Kerry back on the global stage, who was so influential in Paris and indeed was very influential in COP26. And I guess a couple of crumbs of comfort. One is that the bilateral agreement with China particularly around carbon capture and methane. No one talks about methane. I don't know why, but we've got to focus on methane. There appears to be some movement behind that. And I was at my business school 30th year reunion only a couple of weeks ago in the States, and the entire new generation of business leaders is focused on this, not just because of personal conviction, but because they think this is a massive global opportunity. So the picture varies a little, I think, depending on which business leaders you talk to and how much of their sales are overseas. But ultimately, if the US goes backwards for 10 years, then we hit net zero at a later point. And the science will tell us what that does to the temperature. And the costs of adapting to that in the US will be substantial, and it will hit local communities hard. And then, you know, so essentially the proof of the pudding will out, and then we'll be in a disorderly transition rather than the more orderly, measured one that we wanted to do. And I will say, and you know, this is, Miles, your work on net zero is so incredibly important. It troubles me that we have continued to set out what I think are some fairly unrealistic timescales for achieving some of the milestones that we need. So, for example, 2030 is only 90 months away. And it sure as heck doesn't feel like we're going to have a 45% in global emissions reduction by then, to me, sitting here. And I think what that means is we've just got to get really seriously real about, we didn't deal with COVID by pretending it wasn't infectious. We dealt with it by saying, this is the data, this is how we deal with it, we're going to throw everything at it. And that's why I've become a very passionate advocate for carbon removal as well as carbon reduction, and for focus on methane, because I think we've got to pull every possible lever, including in the States.
Very good. Marianne, you want to complement that?
Yeah, we have seen both the US situation, the Australian situation, where the politics and the public is very sort of reluctant, but still the private companies, Microsoft, Snap, Shopify, do what they do voluntarily, very much invest or purchase, make long agreement. Microsoft just announced a 10-year offtake agreement with the direct air company in this space. So there is the opportunity for voluntary and private corporates to do differently, not wait for a global or statewide framework. Of course, in the long run, we do need that, but in the short while, it's very refreshing to see that private corporates are pro-carbon removals and act.
Okay, very good. It's time to wrap this up. Let me thank the panel. Let me thank them for reminding us that there's such a thing as private initiative, but it still needs a little bit of policy. Slightly depressing timescales from Claire, but also a lot of optimism, a lot of sense of opportunity. So thanks all the panelists very much for a stimulating start to the conference.